We just completed the work order edit input screen, and we're going to move over now in this next tutorial. Before we go there to the vendor and purchase area, let's talk a little bit about some of the things you'll see here. You have the service image portal that we discussed and showed you the images that are in the portal that are related to the service images shown on the work order form. You can come in here and do a find based on the image name or the source as far as the product is concerned. I spoke a little bit about this in the last video. There's a larger view of the image from that screen where they had the popover. In this case, I just put some image in there at random so you can see that there are images in that field. In order to get another image in that field, you could replace it. You could export them to something if you needed to, or delete them from the screen, or do a big view where you blow them up so you can see them full view on the screen. This is actually a pretty good size view of any image. Let's go to the next thing we're looking at, and that is the service work order list view. And basically, this is where you can see all the work orders that are currently out there. And this would be where you would want to use a find to find an individual or group of records that are related to something. You can actually do a find in, say, the work order itself, and then come over here and you'll actually see the records that were affected by that particular find that you did. And that way, you always have to come back when you do that. And say, for example, you came to this screen and maybe there was only one record when you know there's a lot more. You have to make sure that you do the show all records so that you bring all the records back. And you can see that I did bring it number 2 so that not all the records were actually being shown. Click on the Show Records button to go to that screen for that particular item that you want to go to. Let's go to the next screen, which is the service information. And we kind of went through here really quick and addressed that you could actually go out into the website and get information from there. But you can also delete a record if you needed to, or do the find in order to bring up a record that is related to a particular product or whatever. And this is still going to bring up the information that you need for groups, say like there were a lot of them. This is for a Whirlpool dryer or whatever. You can find all the records that were affecting that and see if there's any differences. Let's say we did a search and we found 3 records that had the same information for the source. We could cycle through those by doing the Do Next button. Go next, go next. And you can see that it'll move to the next record. Those are the 2 records that are currently in because they're both on the work order number 1. And you can see that this is the work order ID over here in the corner. Now you cannot change that. As I pull in, you can see that it's one single field in yellow. That field is actually locked, so you cannot edit those fields. Once you create a work order, you cannot modify that. The last one on this is the service list information. And this is for the items that we were looking at for service information. It'll be a list of them all. So you can come over to this area too and do a search based on criteria, or you could have done it in the last screen and come over here and those would be the records that be viewed. Like if I wanted to look at dryers or freezers or refrigerators or whatever, you could find just the records for those and then click on this view record and it would take you into that record area. Okay, let's go again to the next thing. Let's start in and look at the first of all, the vendor screen. I'm going to kind of do this a little backwards as far as the buttons are concerned, but I want to show you that you first of all have to create vendors before you can do any purchase orders, because you need the vendor information and the field data for the vendor in that record. The next thing you need to understand is that you have to have already created the inventory that you're using for the application for the parts and pieces of the stuff that was up here before you can actually do a purchase order, because you have to have the part before you can do the purchase order. So what you want to do is go ahead and go into the purchase order. What we're going to do in here, when you go into purchase orders, you'll go in and first of all you'll add a new record if you're going to create a new purchase order. This is very much the same as what you do for an invoice or work order. You go in and you create a new one and it'll add the next sequence number in the actual records. Now for these 2 example records in here, you can go ahead and overwrite those. And what I think you ought to do is just to make it a lot simpler for yourself, periodically you do an inventory update. And what you want to do is go ahead and create a vendor record. It is called, that for the name is inventory update. And that way when you run an inventory update or an initial inventory, when you're adding your products, you can have all those added into one invoice, or you can create another initial inventory to do all the products in a warehouse search for everything that you currently have and everything that's on your truck, if you have a truck where you have products on the truck. Okay, this is the vendor information that would be brought over, and not all these have data in them. I can go to the prior record, for example, and go prior, and you can see one that's pretty well filled in here. So you see where they actually have had a purchase for these items, and I'm going to show you some of the sequencing of information that is taken in here. So I brought in ABC company example. They're in Phoenix, blah, 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 blah. And then these are the technical parts of it where it has the date of the order, the shipping fee if there was one, and you should be tracking your shipping fees in order to find out what is the difference between the product and what was the difference between transportation. And in this case, you have $161 of subtotals for the information that's already in here. And there was 100 paid. And for example, if you pay anything on it, you're going to probably enter it in here to show that you covered that portion of the invoice. And obviously, if you haven't, you're going to see where you have outstanding amounts on your purchase orders. Then you have a balance owed of $61. Now on the invoice, purchase order invoice list view, if you come in here and look at the purchase order invoice list view and invoice itself, you're going to see additional information. For example, this shows all the information that will be printed on an actual purchase order if you print them. If you do not print work orders and you just send them out by fax or whatever, you can do that by making a PDF of this. You can come down here and say print, go in and do a paper size, a paper range if it's one or more. You can scale it if you need to, and then you can say PDF, and you can send it a couple of different ways. You can view it, you can email it, and you can save it. So that's what I'm talking about, where you can take a screen like this and do it. Now, interestingly enough, the way these are set up, the screen here is going to be only printed out. You see this range line here? The range line will be, everything on this side will be within it, and none of this will be shown over here. Now, when you're looking for a particular purchase order, you would do the same thing you do on other things. You start the find, then you go ahead and put in some information, whatever it may be. Now, realize that you cannot put anything in these fields because this is part of a multi-line entry, but you can put in things like the vendor name and all the vendor information. And the one thing that's really critical would be the work order or purchase order ID. And if I put a 1 in there and then go over and say do the find, now you can see that that one is the only one in there out of 2. Now this is what you would do in order to show just the records you want to print from the purchase order that you're working on. There's 2 items in here, and when you get all done, if you had any more in the other record and you hit show all, you would see that they would come back into the record, so you would be able to see them again. So that's all the records in selection. So when you come into this screen, you might, if you get a lot of records in here, all of a sudden when you're just getting started, you're going to see a lot of data come in here. And the way you separate the data is for the purchase order that you're actually working with, and that would be the number that you would use in a find to find that information. Now you have a couple of ways to use this information. As you saw in the purchase order list view, if you get a receiver where you're actually receiving items back from the vendor and you want to actually show them in the list view, I can go to the purchase list view, and this is another screen where as items come in, I can pick the purchase order that this stuff was ordered on, and you may have, maybe from one vendor, you may have 1 or 2 or 3 purchase orders. So you probably want to clear one out at a time, and it may have multiple items. So if I came over here and said, show all, it would show me all the purchase orders that are pending. And what you would do is you can actually go over to the purchase portal and show the items received for that one, or you can go to the actual purchase order. And you can go in here and receive them, each one for the items that were received for the purchase order. So you're in the purchase order input screen, and say, for example, I received the quantity that I was looking for, which was 1. I would go ahead and put my 1 in there. I'd mark it as order received and received. And now what it's going to do is when the order is received in total, this purchase order is concluded, and the whole purchase order should be paid at that time if you haven't received all of the items on there. If you have received them, obviously you would pay the full amount of whatever the balance is. Now this is really up to you and the vendor how you actually pay it. Do you have a partial shipment where they're holding back something they're going to deliver later? Well, you sure wouldn't want to pay the whole thing until you actually received it. So you want to make sure that you're taking care of that. Now if you have an RMA issue, in the past I had a whole screen for RMAs, and my people told me, that my users, that they didn't use it It was a nuisance. They didn't want to use it. But if you go over to the portal, you can go over and make sure that the item that you're in here and you're working with has received, and you can put an order status in there for that. And here is RMA. If you have an RMA and you place an RMA on this, this means that this has an outstanding lien on it, so to speak, and you should not be getting it. And for whatever reason, you can have a short ship. That's another situation where you're not going to pay the whole amount until it's received. And then obviously if you get credited for something where they pay you back because they cannot get it to you, then you'd put credited in there, and then you would go back to the actual purchase order and so amend it to show that it is a credited item, and you want to take it out of that particular work order. Now, for example, if I go back to the purchase order, I would take and do a -1 on that item, and it would remove it instead of having it being paid. And then I would show it, instead of being received, I would show it as credited. And then what it's going to do is it's going to turn around, it's going to make that item be reduced by the account of 1. So I can go in here, and for record purposes, you probably want to go ahead and know that that item was actually ordered and was not received. And in this case, it received the amount in reduction. So that's how it's done. It's very simple. You could see the other one was a balance of 30 some odd dollars or whatever. So -1. Now let's go over here and look at the inventory lookout. You can actually pop over out and look at the prices and stuff like that. If you're going to a vendor and you want to see what you last paid, you can pop into that actual record over in the inventory and see what you paid the last time you had that vendor order. Or you can look at vendors that have the same part number or your part number that you're ordering from multiple vendors, and you can see who had the lowest price and call that client or vendor if you want to. And as you see up here, it says no editing in this area. You cannot edit in this screen. You can just view it. Okay, let's go back and actually look at the next thing down here on the list. We looked at the purchase portal. If you need to delete a record for one reason or another, this is where you would come to delete it. Let's go back in again. We did the vendor screen, and now the vendor list view is the only thing we haven't done yet, and this would be a list of your vendors. So you can go in here once you create the records for them. You can search for them if you need to modify something, add something, or look for a vendor information as far as their phone, their mailing address, or whatever. You can go into that record and look at that particular information in there. And as I did in the other one, you have a URL. You can push on the button here, tap it, and that'll give you the website for that particular website for that vendor. And that will allow you to go through their inventory as far as if they have it shown on their screens, and you can do some pricing or whatever, especially if it's a wholesaler. Okay, let's go back. Now, this pretty much concludes all the areas that we've gone through as far as vendor. The last place we're going to be going is we're going to show you some of the ancillary screens down here at the bottom, and that'll close the lessons for this video help. Thank you.